So when we think of the sonnet tradition, and if, even if you watch some of our previous videos on the sonnet, you'll know that the sonnet is Italian and English, right? We even have these terms, the Italian sonnet, the English sonnet, which have their own rhyme schemes and things like this. But as America came of age, as America developed a native literary tradition from the early 1800s through the mid 1800s, sonnets came with the English language culture to America and took root and blossomed into wonderful fruitfulness. Some pretty popular and more well-known sonnets are by people like Edgar Allan Poe, whose sonnet to science is probably the most famous of sonnets of his corpus. There was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. We probably should do a whole video on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and the sonnet. He wrote many, many, many of them. Other sonneteers, even Walt Whitman tried his hand at a 14-line poem that kind of rhymes. It's kind of a sonnet. But there were a couple poets in American history that aren't very well known other than as sonneteers. One of these is Emma Lazarus, who actually, she didn't write a lot of sonnets, and we've already talked about her quite a bit on this channel. But there are two poets who wrote a lot of sonnets, and their names have almost been totally forgotten outside of poetry circles. So Jones Very has an interesting story. He, like a lot of writers of his age, he wrote in the mid 19th century. He was a good old Salem boy like Nathaniel Hawthorne. And like Nathaniel Hawthorne, he had kind of this haunted religious imagination that wasn't always entirely positive. He had religious visions that he would talk about and he wrote sonnets about, but he also ended his life in a mental institution. And people who knew him said, he was a fascinating man, a genius of a writer, but very strange. A friend of his writes a story about how if you were walking next to Jones Very, talking to him, he could never walk in a straight line. He was very socially awkward, and he would always end up bumping into you if you tried to go on a walk with him, kind of by accident, absent-mindedly. But he was quite a sonneteer. Let me share with you one of his sonnets. This is called Yourself. 'Tis to yourself I speak. You cannot know him whom I call in speaking, such an one. For thou beneath the earth liest buried low, which he alone as living walks upon. Thou mayest at times have heard him speak to you, and often wished perchance that you were he, and I must ever wish that it were true. For then thou couldst hold fellowship with me, but now thou hearest us talk as strangers, met above the room wherein thou liest abed. A word perhaps loud spoken thou mayst get, or hear our feet when heavily they tread. But he who speaks or him who's spoken to must both remain as strangers still to you. Similar to what Emily Dickinson would write about, this is kind of an address to someone who's dead. And it's this odd meditation on what the dead overhear and what the living may not realize about the dead's witness of them. But it's interesting that Very is addressing this to the you that is gone. 'Tis to yourself I speak. You cannot know him whom I call in speaking such an one, for thou beneath the earth liest buried low. Jones Very has a dark and meditative tone and mood that is fascinating and is worth checking out. I want to turn from Very, though, to Frederick Goddard Tuckerman. Now, Frederick Goddard Tuckerman is another New England boy. Tuckerman wrote pretty much only sonnets, and it's only been recently that all of his sonnets have been republished in modern editions. So Tuckerman was a lawyer and a bit of a polymath. He studied astronomy, he studied botany, and you'll see in the poem we look at that he has a very attentive eye to the beauty of the physical world. This is Sonnet 10 from his third series of sonnets. Sometimes I walk where the deep water dips against the land, or on where fancy drives, I walk and muse aloud, like one who strives to tell his half-shaped thought with stumbling lips, and view the ocean sea, the ocean ships with joyless heart. Still but myself I find, and restless phantoms of my restless mind, only the moaning of my wandering words, only the wailing of the wheeling plover, and this high rock, beneath whose base the sea has wormed long caverns, like my tears in me. And hard like this I stand, and beaten and blind, this desolate rock with lichens rusted over, hoar with salt sleet, and the chalkings of the birds. This is such a wonderful example of a poem that really gets into the connection between the natural world and the internal world of the self, but ends not with a, and so I mourn, or and so life floats me by, or, and so eternity is what I'm headed for. A lesser poet might try that. He ends with this very concrete image of the salt sleet and the chalkings of the birds on the rocks. Chalkings is such a wonderful word there. It's kind of a gross image, the bird droppings, but he doesn't say droppings of the birds, which might almost sound like a little silly or vulgar. The chalkings of the birds, almost as if they're writing. Tuckerman is, unlike Veery, very attuned to, I think, what we would think of as more contemporary language. He doesn't have these and thous in here. He has, in fact, a boldness to repeat main words multiple times in the same line. I think of lines like, and view the ocean sea, the ocean ships. Also, and restless phantoms of my restless mind. Once again, I think we might, if we were in a poetry workshop, say you can't use restless twice in a line. Why would you do that? Find a different word. But he's got this sort of incantatory ability to make those words feel right and kind of like they're building an intensity, as opposed to, he couldn't think of another word. One of the things I like about both Veery and Tuckerman is they're picking up on these themes that we find in other poets, but doing them in ways that are kind of new and different, or unfamiliar, at least to those who maybe have just had a brief overview, your Poes and your Whitmans and your Dickinsons, and then moved on from the 19th century. Hang out with Jones Veery and Frederick, Goddard, Tuckerman, and you'll find similar themes to those we really prize in those other poets, but new approaches, new beauties, and new avenues of genius that hopefully, like the sea, will worm long caverns into us, into our imaginations.